Hey guys, so if you're a follower of my channel, you should know that I usually begin every year with a series of Batman reviews. This year was no exception, and I'm ending 2025 series of Batman reviews with a top 10 list for Batman Beyond. Now, Batman Beyond is an animated sci-fi superhero series created by Timm, Paul Dini, and Alan Burnett, and of course based on the DC Comics character created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. Now, Batman Beyond is set within the same continuity as Batman the Animated Series and Superman the Animated Series and the New Batman Adventures, but it's set 40 years in the future. Shows like Static Shock, Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited are also set within this universe. However, even though those came out after this, they are set before this in the continuity. Now, Batman Beyond aired from 1999 to 2001. I think the first two seasons aired on Kids WB, and the last season aired on Cartoon Network. Now, Batman Beyond, in so many ways, is a show that should not have worked as well as it did. From what I understand, Warner Brothers told Timm that they wanted to do a more kid-friendly version of Batman the Animated Series, even though Batman the Animated Series was already geared towards children. Quite a few episodes did touch on pretty mature themes, and some of the episodes got really dark, and the show ended up appealing more towards older children and teens. And basically, they wanted Timm to create a show about a teenage Batman to appeal to younger viewers, and of course Timm thought the idea was gonna suck, which is why it's ironic that the show ended up being honestly pretty damn good. And as far as the show being more kid-friendly, well, obviously Timm threw that edict out the window, because Batman Beyond at the time was probably the darkest DC animated series. Like, this show got really dark at points, and honestly really did sort of push the envelope of what was appropriate for children's television. Like, there are several episodes of this show that go into full-fledged body horror territory. Also, with the show being set in the future, it very much embraces a dystopian/cyberpunk aesthetic, and is very much inspired by stuff like Blade Runner and especially Akira. There's actually a lot of Akira in this show. You can also tell Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns also had an influence on this show, especially with the old man Bruce Wayne. Honestly, the show was a cyberpunk series first and foremost, and a superhero series second. And being a cyberpunk show, a lot of the episodes touched on themes of corporate corruption and mishandling of technologies like AI and genetic engineering. So I rewatched the whole series recently because I have no life outside of my job and this YouTube channel, and I'm gonna say it, and this is gonna be a very controversial statement, but I actually think Batman Beyond is better than Batman the Animated Series. I actually think the storyline is a lot more consistent, and I think the arc that we see Terry McGinnis go on throughout the series is really fascinating, and what the show does really well is, yes, it is essentially a sequel to Batman the Animated Series. It's very much within that world. At the same time, the show very much has an identity all its own. Very much how in-universe Terry McGinnis, who is the Batman of this future Gotham City, is very much his own character. Yes, he is Batman now, but he's not Bruce Wayne, and he's a very different Batman than Bruce Wayne. And I thought it was very smart of the showrunners to pay respect to what came before, but also not be slavishly devoted to the past. Now, the basic premise of Batman Beyond is it's set 40 or 50 years after the events of Batman the Animated Series, and Bruce Wayne is now an old man and has long since quit being Batman. And in the show, we follow this troubled teenager named Terry McGinnis who has a chance encounter with Bruce Wayne and ends up accidentally discovering that this guy was Batman. Later on, Terry finds out that his father was murdered, so he ends up up stealing a high-tech version of the Batsuit that Bruce was using later on in his career, and he goes out to avenge his father's death. Now, Bruce is pissed about this at first and even tries to stop Terry, but seeing a kindred spirit in him, he decides to ultimately take him under his wing, and the show at its heart is really a coming-of-age story about this young man, both trying to fill Bruce's shoes as Batman, but also becoming his own man and forging his own path. And what the show does so well is, this is not our Batman, yet Terry does earn the right to be called Batman, and both Bruce and Terry end up learning from each other throughout the series. And their dynamic is so well written. And again, this is the same version of Bruce Wayne that we saw in Batman the Animated Series, yet it almost feels like a different character. Like, this is a much more bitter, cynical Bruce Wayne, a Bruce Wayne who's been hardened by literally decades of experience and decades of tragedy. And Terry basically ends up showing Bruce how to be human again, whereas Bruce gives Terry the guidance he needed because, let's be honest, had they not met each other, Terry probably would have eventually ended up in jail, because he was a very troubled kid. But without further ado, here are my top 10 favorite episodes of Batman Beyond, and believe me, picking only 10 was tough. Number 10 on my list is the Season 2 episode, The Egg Baby. Now, a lot of the show focused on the absurdity of Terry having the balance, both being Batman and being a high school student, as well as balancing that with his social life. A lot of episodes from Season 2 dealt with typical high school drama, which I think was actually a mandate from Warner Brothers. I know the writers weren't crazy about, but this was one of the episodes where they really made that work. Now, it's a comedic episode, and honestly, the episode is freaking hilarious. The basic premise of the episode is for one of Terry's classes, they have to take care of these stupid little robot egg babies and treat them as if they're real babies. Now, Terry was already failing this class, and he desperately needs the grade. The issue is, Terry is also Batman, so while taking care of this robot egg baby, he also has to stop this jewel thief and her two sons. Again, it's a very silly, very comedic episode, but it's fun. It's just a lot of fun. It also has one of the show's funniest moments when Terry is on a mission, and Bruce is talking to him from the Batcave, and he hears the egg baby and thinks it's a real baby and is like, is that a baby? You brought a baby with you? Is there something you want to tell me, Terry? Number 9 is Hooked Up, another Season 2 episode. Basically, in this episode, some teenagers, including some of Terry's classmates, get addicted to this virtual reality video game that basically allows them to see what their hearts desire most. And the issue is, these kids have become so dependent on this virtual reality that when they're unhooked from it, they basically go through withdrawals. And it turns out this is all a plot by Spellbinder, who is a psychotic psychiatrist who uses technology to make people either hallucinate or to hypnotize people. Now, Spellbinder was introduced in a Season 1 episode, and I know this is a character from older comics from way back in the day, but the way they build him up in the show, he basically is sort of an analog to Scarecrow. Like, in a way, he's almost Terry's Scarecrow. But this episode is really damn good, and the fact that Spellbinder is targeting kids makes it all the more insidious. And the episode also has a commentary on child abuse. Like, you find out that some of these kids are from broken homes and kind of had a reason, or thought they had a reason, to escape reality. There's also an obvious commentary on drug addiction, with this virtual reality essentially being sort of an allegory for drugs. Number 8 on my list is the 2-part pilot episode, Rebirth, which I think brilliantly establishes the lore of this series. In this episode, we find out that Bruce Wayne quit being Batman for honestly a very believable reason. It turns out over the years he developed a heart condition, and on his final mission he literally had a heart attack and out of sheer desperation picked up a gun and threatened one of the kidnappers with it, and this completely broke him and he felt he wasn't worthy of being Batman anymore. We then jump ahead to years and years later. It turns out that Bruce's company has been bought out by this ruthless, corrupt businessman named Derek Powers. And it turns out that Powers is planning on selling this deadly bioweapon to rogue governments, and one of his employees, a man named Warren McGinnis, finds out about this and plans on exposing him. So Powers has him murdered, and this prompts Terry into stealing the Batsuit and becoming the new Batman. But this was a fantastic episode. Honestly, it almost works as its own little movie. Now, big spoiler, but the episode does end with Derek Powers getting exposed to this bioweapon, basically transforming him into a radioactive monster who would become known later on in the season as Blight, who basically becomes the main antagonist of season 1 and in essence is sort of like Terry's Joker. Now, Powers, or Blight, was actually voiced by Sherman Howard, who horror fans might recognize as Bub from Day of the Dead, and I actually met him in 2023 at Mahoning Drive-In. Number 7 on my list is the season 2 episode Eyewitness, and this is a really good Barbara Gordon episode, and I absolutely love what the show did with Barbara Gordon. Basically, at this point in the timeline, Barbara Gordon is now the police commissioner of Gotham City, much like her father, Jim Gordon, and making her the police commissioner just makes so much sense for the character. But I also like how, at this point, Barbara Gordon has a very cynical view of superheroes, despite the fact that she was Batgirl when she was younger. And in the series itself, we never find out in its entirety, but we get these hints that something happened that broke up the Bat family. We eventually find out what that was in the spin-off movie Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker. But in the episode, Barbara Gordon witnesses, or believes that she witnessed, Batman murder Mad Stan, who is sort of an anarchist terrorist, and so now Batman is on the run, and she of course knows that Batman is Terry McGinnis, so now Terry is on the run as well. In the episode, you see Bruce Wayne having to desperately prove Terry's innocence, and I don't want to give too much else away about the episode besides that, but it's a very good episode. And the episode also really develops Barbara and Terry's relationship, where throughout a lot of the series, Barbara was very distrustful of Terry because of his history as a juvenile delinquent, and this is the episode where she really starts to realize, okay, maybe I was wrong. It's another episode about Terry having to prove himself as a worthy successor to Batman. Also, I do want to point out the character of Mad Stan. This character is freaking hilarious. Even though he's a terrorist, they play him up for comic relief, which you can kind of tell the show is pre-9/11. The fact that you have a terrorist as a comedic relief character. But Mad Stan is voiced by Henry Rollins, which is just fucking hilarious. Number 6 on my list is the season 1 finale, Ascension, which is the final episode that featured Derek Powers, or Blight, which is kind of a shame that they ended the Blight story arc here, because they really were building this character up to be essentially Terry's arch nemesis. But you could argue that maybe it's better that they didn't overuse this character, and I think this episode perfectly wraps up the Blight storyline. Now, throughout the whole season, Derek Powers was wearing this artificial skin to hide the fact that he's been turned into this radioactive monster. The issue is the radiation is eating its way through the skin. Now, while Derek Powers is a bad guy, this episode does actually humanize him a little bit, where he essentially knows that he's at the end of his rope because of his condition, and he wants his son, Paxton Powers, to take over the company, and we see him trying to kind of reconnect with his son, and we get a sense that this was not a good relationship at all, that it was probably a very abusive relationship. And in the episode, we see Derek Powers get exposed as being Blight on live television, and he ends up going into hiding. And again, while he is a bad dude, you do start to feel some pity for him, especially when his son, who turns out to be just as much of a sleazebag as him, ends up betraying him. There is also a great moment where Batman, who of course is Terry McGinnis, confronts Blight, and without actually revealing his identity, he just tells him that he has a vendetta against him because he murdered his father, and Blight just coldly says, "Do you have any idea how little that narrows it down?" But yeah, it's a great episode and a great finale for Season 1. Number 5 is Earthmover from Season 2, and what I really liked about this episode is it leans heavily into horror and really does feel like an old-school horror story. Basically, in the episode, one of Terry's friends is being stalked, and we eventually learn that her stalkers are these mud people. Now, we also learn that her father died several years ago, and she was adopted by her father's best friend. And I really don't want to give too much else away about this episode, but we do learn that her father's best friend, who is technically her adopted father, he did something really bad in the past, and in kind of an EC Comics-like fashion, he now must reap what he's sown, where his past does come back to haunt him. And the revelation of what actually happened to this girl's father and who the villain of the episode is both heartbreaking and genuinely terrifying. Number 4 on my list is another Season 2 episode, Sneak Peek, and basically this is about this sleazy tabloid reporter who always seems to have the inside scoop on all these scandals or people's darkest secrets, and he exposes them on his show. And we find out that the reason he's able to do this is a few years ago he stole this technology that actually allows him to vibrate his atoms in such a way where he could move through walls. And he ends up discovering Batman's identity, as well as the identity of the old Batman, obviously Bruce Wayne, and now threatens to expose their secret on his show. But this technology has made his atoms unstable, and I don't want to give away what happens to him at the end, but the implications are genuinely pretty horrific. And even though this guy was a sleazebag, and in general was a pretty bad guy, you do find yourself feeling some pity for him at the end, even though to some degree it also serves him right. But it's a very good episode and a really good critique on tabloid reporters and the paparazzi, and how people like the main villain of this episode really have no qualms about just ruining people's lives and reputations just to get more ratings. Number 3 is the Season 2 episode Splicers, another episode that definitely leans heavily into body horror. Basically, in this episode, there's a trend sweeping Gotham City where people are actually having their DNA spliced with animal DNA, making them into human-animal hybrids. And the trend is mainly sweeping Gotham's youth. And the episode definitely satirizes youth culture and certain trendy fads, and how when you're a teenager, you want to be an individual, you want to be independent. At the same time, you also want to fit into your friend group. I think that's exemplified in a scene where one of the teenage splicers says that he got spliced because it makes him an individual just like all my friends. Again, it's like these kids are equating individuality with conformity. Now, admittedly, the episode does leave me kind of conflicted, where it's like, okay, if something like splicing really existed, part of me is almost like, if it's adults doing it, then that's technically their choice. Like, it's their choice what to do with their own bodies. The issue in the episode is it's a lot of teenagers who are getting spliced, and the main villain of the episode, Kubier, the man who's running the splicing program, he's clearly targeting kids. Also, when splicing is outlawed in the episode, Kubier tries to have the district attorney of Gotham City killed, so he is not a good guy at all. And like I said, the episode definitely leans into body horror. Now yes, it doesn't go as hard as if this were a David Cronenberg movie. It's still a kid's show, but there are some moments in this episode that I can see freaking a little kid out. Like, there's a scene where Terry McGinnis is injected with some of the splicing formula against his will and is turned into a half-human, half-bat creature, which definitely calls to mind Man-Bat from the pilot episode of Batman the Animated Series on Leather Wings. Now, throughout a lot of this, I tried to be as spoiler-free as possible, but for this episode in particular, I do want to give away the ending, just because I thought it was really freaking cool. Basically, at the end of the episode, the villain, Kubier, he ends up injecting himself with several strands of animal DNA and literally transforms himself into a chimera. But then Batman ends up injecting Kubier with multiple syringes containing the splicing formula, and he can't control the mutations anymore and mutates into this horrific monster. And honestly, his mutation at the end calls to mind Tetsuo's mutation at the end of Akira. Like, seriously, as he was mutating at the end, I was half expecting him to cry out, Kaneda! Number 2 on my list is Out of the Past from Season 3. Basically, in the episode, it's Bruce Wayne's birthday, and he's really starting to feel his age. At this point in the timeline, he's like in his late 70s, early 80s, and what happens is he gets a visit from an old friend, that being Talia al Ghul, the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul. I'm not sure how to properly pronounce it, and they actually do make a point of that in the episode, where Terry constantly pronounces his name wrong, and I forgot which one is the proper way to say it in this episode. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the mythology of this character, Ra's al Ghul is an immortal who's been around for hundreds of years, who resurrects himself with what's known as the Lazarus Pit. But in this episode, we learn that Ra's has been dead a long time, and Talia has been keeping herself young with the Lazarus Pit. And she offers Bruce Wayne a chance to be young again, and he reluctantly goes through with it, but ends up not really liking it because he knows it's unnatural. He knows it's not meant to be. And as the episode goes on, we come to learn that Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul, might not be as dead as we think he is. Now, I know I've given away some spoilers in my descriptions of some of the other episodes, but for this one, I want to be as spoiler-free as possible. All I will say is, when you find out what exactly Ra's did to stay alive, it's fucked up, to say the least. And I think even the writers have said that this is probably the most disturbing concept they've come up with in terms of how to bring a villain back. But it's a fantastic episode, and there's a great moment where you see the newly rejuvenated Bruce Wayne fighting alongside Terry, and it's a very crowd-pleasing moment if you're a follower of the series, and if you've been paying attention to how these two characters' relationship has developed over the course of the series. Now, this was not the series finale, but I actually think this episode would have been a great finale and a great conclusion to the series if they chose to air it last. I do want to point out that Talia in this episode was voiced by Olivia Hussey, who people might recognize from the 60s version of Romeo and Juliet, but horror fans would probably recognize her from movies like Black Christmas and Psycho 4 and the 1990 adaptation of Stephen King's It, where she played Bill Denbrough's wife. She was a fantastic actress. She unfortunately passed away last year. And my number 1 favorite episode is the Season 1 episode, Meltdown, which features the return of Mr. Freeze. Now, Mr. Freeze in the older Batman comics was sort of a gimmicky, two-dimensional bad guy. He was even featured on a few episodes of the Adam West Batman series from the 1960s. But Batman the Animated Series famously reinvented the character of Mr. Freeze and gave him a very tragic backstory backstory that almost felt like Shakespearean tragedy. But because of his characterization in the animated series, they ended up incorporating that backstory into the comics and graphic novels. Now, I wasn't crazy about what they did with the character in the new Batman adventures, because I feel like it kind of negated his supposed redemption arc in the spin-off movie Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero, which I think gave him a pretty satisfying conclusion, and what they did with him in the new Batman adventures felt like kind of a betrayal. Luckily, though, his appearance in new Batman adventures gets a very satisfying but also very tragic conclusion in this episode. So basically, in the episode, Derek Powers is desperate to find a cure for his condition. Remember, this is before the episode Ascension, which was his final appearance. And it turns out that Victor Freeze is still alive, but is literally a head being kept in a storage container because his condition has kept him alive, but has destroyed the rest of his body. And Powers decides to use Freeze as essentially a guinea pig, where they clone a new body for Victor Freeze and then implant his mind into that body. So now Victor Freeze is essentially human again. But Powers is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing this to see if he could eventually clone a new body for himself, or potentially even steal Victor's body. But in the episode, we see Victor Freeze now as a human trying to make amends for the things he's done in the past, and Terry is fully supportive of this, whereas Bruce Wayne is a little more skeptical. But things unfortunately take a tragic turn when Freeze's body starts to revert back to the condition of his old body, and he also finds out that Powers was planning on betraying him, culminating in him becoming Mr. Freeze again by the end. It's a very good, but also very sad and tragic episode, and Freeze's final lines to Batman at the end of the episode are legitimately pretty heartbreaking. That's something that the show did really well, is they used old villains sparingly, but when they did, you know you were in for something special. Now I just want to give a few honorable mentions. Gollum and Heroes from Season 1 were both really good episodes. You also had Hidden Agenda from Season 2. That was another really good episode. So was Babel from Season 2. You also had The Last Resort and Ace in the Hole. Those were also really good episodes. So was Lost Soul, which featured a really creepy performance from Stacy Keach. You also had the episode Zeta, which was a really good one. That episode actually got its own spin-off series called The Zeta Project. Big Time, that was another really good episode. So was the sequel to that episode, Betrayal. You also had the two-part episode The Call, which featured Superman and a future version of the Justice League. And honestly, every episode that revolved around Ink. Ink was a really interesting villain, who I think was an original villain created for the show, but I know she was later incorporated into the comics. Now, I mentioned already that there was a spin-off movie, Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker. Now, it was released in 2000, so it came out during the series' initial run. Now, continuity-wise, I'm not sure when exactly the movie is supposed to be taking place, but I actually think the movie would work really well if you watch it right after watching the entire series. And in my opinion, the movie provides a perfect bridge between Batman Beyond and Batman the Animated Series. In the movie, we find out what happened to the Joker shortly after the events of Batman the Animated Series, and we find out what it was that officially broke up the Bat family, and spoiler, it was pretty freaking dark. Now, after the show, Terry McGinnis would show up on some of the other DC animated series. Like, there's an episode of Static Shock where Virgil is sent into the future and meets Terry McGinnis. There was also a two-part episode of Justice League Unlimited where a crazy time traveler was destroying the time-space continuum, and in that episode, the Justice League end up getting sent into the future, and they meet Terry McGinnis and the older Bruce Wayne, as well as an older Static Shock. And then the series finale of Justice League Unlimited, Epilogue, actually focuses on an older Terry McGinnis, and I think Bruce Timm has said said that episode should essentially serve as the true finale of Batman Beyond. Now, that was a good episode, but I'm not crazy about a certain revelation involving Bruce and Terry's relationship that, in my opinion at least, kind of negated the whole point of Batman Beyond, but again, that's just my opinion. There have also been Batman Beyond comic books, some of which actually are in continuity with the show, and others are actually set in the mainstream DC universe. Now, at one point, I think there was going to be a Batman Beyond movie that I think was actually going to be made by the same people who made Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. But unfortunately, that project never came to fruition, but dear God, I would love to see them do more Batman Beyond stuff. Honestly, I would love to see a revival of this series. I mean, I know Kevin Conroy's no longer with us, so you either have to recast Bruce Wayne, or, honestly, maybe say that Bruce Wayne died between the events of Batman Beyond and the revival. Basically, have him die and really just have it focus on Terry McGinnis. But who knows if that's ever gonna happen. But yeah, that was my top 10 favorite episodes of Batman Beyond / sort of an overview of the whole series. And bye.